This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
Malicious software, or malware, can harm your computer in a variety of ways, and sometimes the effects are not known until it's too late. What's worse, your computer can become one of many infected with malware, creating a botnet, short for robot, and network. Cyber criminals use special malware, usually a Trojan horse, to breach the security of several users' computers. These take control of each computer and organize all of the infected machines into a network of bots, which are unwitting tools that the cybercriminal can remotely manage. The infected system may act completely normal with no warning signs. A bot can be a PC, Mac, or even a smartphone. Oftentimes, the cybercriminal will seek to infect and control thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of computers, so that they can act as the master of a large zombie network or bot network. These botnets are capable of delivering many different types of cybercrimes, such as DDoS attacks, spreading malware, online fraud, and wide-scale spam or phishing campaigns.
The Canadian technology community has a long history of working together with government and regulators to counter online harms such as botnets, spam, and malicious hacking. It therefore came as a surprise when the CRTC launched a consultation on addressing botnets that raised the possibility of the regulator stepping in with new blocking mandates. The consultation just completed its first round of comments, and in addition to industry experts, there were others that opportunistically looked at the blocking discussion as the chance to promote copyright-related blocking or other internet blocking requirements. Jonathan Curtis has been at the heart of battling botnets and online harms for decades, with work at Bell, the CRTC, and other leading security companies. He joins me on the podcast in a personal capacity to place the online security challenges in historical context and to outline both the benefits and risks that come from the potential blocking approaches raised by the CRTC. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you can join us. I typically have had primarily legal and regulatory people on, so to have someone who comes from the security space to talk about these issues from a security perspective, but which invoke considerable number of policy issues and policy implications, I think is really great. Now, you've been in the security space for decades in Canada, working for leading telecom companies, security companies, and regulators. Now, you're joining the podcast in a personal capacity, representing only your own views, but can you start us off with a little bit of a background on your experience and past work?
Sure. Well, thanks again. It's my pleasure to speak to you today, Michael. So, in 1995, I started off with Bell Simpatico. It was actually called Navigo at the time. And we, as engineers, we kind of built out that service over the course of the next, I guess I was there for 14 years, and accountable for email, anti-spam, internet safety and security. And during my time at Bell Canada, I managed to build a few nonprofits to fight spam, notably the messaging, malware, and mobile anti-abuse working group. It's an international organization, nonprofit, comprised of all the leading social networks, telecom, email service providers, ISPs, et cetera, and with a common goal of restoring trust in the consumer, but also protecting that same consumer. I moved from Bell in 2008. I took a job in California with a DNS vendor that was supplying about 40% of the world's telecoms with DNS services, and an application that would support that, and wrote a product, or built a product that would block malicious domains. And then, after, I guess, 300,000 miles a year in a plane, I decided I'd step back. I had helped a little bit with the early days of Castle, and wanted to come back home to Ottawa and work more closely to my family and And the CRTC had some roles, and worked with them for about 4 years, implementing CASL, bringing it into force, helping with some of the regulatory, the regs, the regulations. And of course, the Spam Reporting Center was something I put into place. So back in 2012 and 13, and then when it was launched in 14, I felt I had done a fair bit with the CRTC, did a little bit on the telecom side there as well, and to help track down, malicious callers to elderly people in the country. So from there, I went back to my roots in California and worked for some threat intel companies, and now been, I guess, 5 years with a company by the name of SecureOnyx. Again, I don't represent their view; these are my views, but that's kind of how I spent the last, I guess, 25 years.
Well, thanks for the work that you've done, and it's been a really interesting career that's put you at the center of some really important issues. You noted spam, but there's been a number of other issues as well. One of the issues that has been getting more and more attention of late has to do with internet blocking. It's been a policy issue for some time. Debates about copyright-related blocking certainly took center stage a number of years ago. Those copyright blocking debates are back. We are also likely to see online harms legislation that could include demand to block some sites. And the CRTC has opened the door to botnet blocking as part of a somewhat surprising consultation that they launched. When I tend to think about the legal evolution on this issue, but can you walk us through a little bit the security policy related history of blocking in Canada?
Yeah. So it's not heavily broadcasted, although some of the companies I work with they would put some hints in the annual reports, and so some of the things we had done in the past, like in 1996, for example, internet news was getting blasted by spam. And so we put some products in place to just drop, about 90% or 80%, give or take a few points there. But a huge amount of spam that was coming into internet news. Now, internet news is sort of a closet kind of application that really hasn't had mainstream attention. But email, certainly in 1998, when we were being overloaded with spam at that point, had to put in provisions in place to first sideline messages, and then users could go and look at the spam that they didn't really want to get. And then we kind of morphed that into, deleting the message or deleting messages from certain IP addresses. So blocking content, if you will, whether it was from a domain or an IP address. And we're going to talk more on those two technologies and some protocol technologies in a minute. But there was, in 98, it was, 30, 40%. By 2000, it had grown to, 80, 90% of all email was spam. 2002, network worms were born. And, basically this is where you could just become infected by plugging into the network because of some weak security behind some applications, most specifically the, TCP port 135 through 139. There was quite an outbreak of malicious software through that. And so we, as ISPs, we band together and we ended up blocking those protocols, and those are still in place today. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is still in play today. I'll differentiate if it's different, if it is, has changed or morphed into something else. But so that's permanent blocks almost 20 years ago because of botnets, because of malware. And then in about 2003, that's when we formed MOG, and then started writing practices for other ISPs around the world to, block those ports, worked with vendors in the space, Microsoft, most notably, to ensure we had, the right protocols, the right pieces of the puzzle in place to help protect those vulnerable applications. We went ahead and blocked port 25 as well for outbound email to the internet. So you'd have to use your ISP's email, or you'd have to authenticate to an email server on another protocol, on another port, a secure port. So we pushed those standards forward in the early 2000s. We wrote best practices around this and spread the word through MOG and other organizations like the OECD and the London Action Plan and whatnot. And then, lo and behold, in 2006, I met with British Telecom, and they had developed a system around blocking illegal images of children being exploited on the internet. And this was kind of a no-brainer, whereby to view the content's illegal, to share the content's illegal, to distribute anything to do with child exploitation is illegal in this country. And so that was a clear differentiator around wanting to move ahead with this. And there was a number of, public policy practices that we looked at as well in terms of having an ombudsman like a cybertip.ca, having a vetted list that, you don't end up with over-blocking, very specific technology around blocking URLs and not even blocking by domain or IP address for that matter. And it was all under the premise that it was unintentional access and that therefore we would just delete any logs. And that system's still in place today. And, I think it's a true testament to putting in a system, a voluntary system, to allow ISPs to work together. I mean, that can, if you Google, Clean Feed Canada, I think you wrote an article back then on it, and all the major ISPs, work together on that. So fast forward a few years, and Industry Canada in 2013 created a security best practice with the telecom service providers around mitigation of threats around, core networking items such as hiding of the core network routers and stuff like that, so that they weren't easily identifiable, and therefore, you could create a denial of service attack against them. If you can't see them, you can't hit them. That kind of an idea, and a number of other critical security practices that are just common practice. The FCC also published, I think it was 2012. MOG had published a number of updated practices with the London Action Plan in 2015. And then 2018, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity came about, and it's a great center for a center of excellence around tracking malware, sharing from government to industry, sharing that type of information in a timely fashion to help mitigate threats. And then 2020, so the Canadian government has spent significant funding on what they call a public-private partnership, a triple P. And that's just one example of that. And I'll draw back on that as we carry forward here. But in 2020, Industry Canada went back and updated the practices from 2013. They didn't hit pause and put shelve a practice. Malware evolves. These groups, I know for a fact at Industry Canada, they meet with the telecoms on a regular basis to work with not only telecoms but other critical infrastructure providers to ensure the safety and well-being of Canada's critical infrastructure, right? So which telecom is a part of. So that's kind of a history, and I think it's a 25 year, I guess, history of voluntarily blocking bad stuff where it's possible for Canadians, right?
The CRTC consultation focuses on botnets. In a sense, the sense that I'm getting from your description of how these issues have evolved is that I was going to ask, how has the security industry addressed the issue in the past before the CRTC comes along? And I think you've, in a sense, answered it. The industry has been actively working with government, sharing information to develop best practices that then gets implemented by the various companies. Is that a rough approximation about how things have been addressed?
Yeah, I mean, where possible, we're going to get into technology limitations around botnets and control. I call them choke points, for lack of a better term. But really, yes, that's correct, Michael. They collaborate together. Sort of a co-opetition, if you will. So, if your network's bad and you're close to my network, you have a greater impact on my network because of proximity, right? The round trip of an attack is a lot shorter. You can do a lot more damage when you're in the same country against each other, And that was part of the reason, actually, in 2002, we started working with other ISPs in Canada to, get them to adopt, and a lot of them were already adopting, but it was just sort of an awareness thing to go ahead and block some of these protocol-based, vulnerabilities, and then, of course, with phishing sites, sharing of IP addresses across, public domain around phishing sites to try to understand if, you needed to block a phishing site. And then a lot of times it was just a takedown service that would need to be consulted, because the battle isn't just about, blocking a botnet, right? There's so many more things that are going to happen when that happen when these miscreants go off and launch an attack. There's so many other components. There's the fish mail that came in, or there's the payload that came in, or there's the user has to click on a link. There's some other website that's not even part of the botnet command and control. There's there's peer-to-peer networks.
The CRTC identifies several different types of blocking efforts. They talk about IP address blocking, domain-based blocking, and then blocking similar to Project CleanFeed that you mentioned a few moments ago. It would be great if we could sort of walk through each of those. Why don't we start with IP address blocking?
Sure.
How does it work? What are some of the advantages? And I suppose notably, what are some of the risks?
Sure. So, IP blocking in an IPv4 world, where I think it's and I could be off by a few billion here. I think it's about 4 or 8 billion IP addresses. I should know it off the top of my head. But IPv6 is thousands and thousands of times more addresses on the internet. Think of it as, like if you had an unlimited amount of phone calls, you could go off and spoof as many as you want, but you could make phone calls from legitimate numbers and never run out of them. Well, that's IPv6, right? In IPv4, there's a finite number, and it's tightly controlled, and it's well known who owns what in most corners. And yes, you can do IP-based blocking, but in the core of a carrier network, there's limitations that you need to really pay attention to. And a lot of folks wouldn't understand this because they're not running, terabit network or gigabit networks across, a country, right? And so there are limitations within BGP and within IP blocking, and we estimate that to be in the neighborhood. And I've spoken to a number of operators in this, and it's about 200,000 IP addresses, which has not changed a whole lot. There's been certainly technology evolution in innovation. But it's still in that range of about 200,000 unique IP addresses. So, it also can allow for, so it can give you some coverage, right? It's limited, but it can give you some coverage. It can give you, and I mean that like you could get like 5% coverage of malware or some small percentage, right? You could block an entire country using IP or BGP type blocking. You can block an entire company or an entire carrier that way. And that actually has happened in the past. There's some countries that have they've had some questionable businesses that were over 95% or 100% malicious actors in that network. So, carriers had taken some liberties in the late 90s and early 2000s, just blocked the entire company. That's no longer a mainstay because criminals have evolved their game, right? The other thing about IP blocking is it's relatively inexpensive to a large carrier. To do the 200,000, you can do it fairly easily. You still need to manage it, though. You still need to go and do what's called collateral damage for every IP, so that you're not taking out like an Amazon or a content distribution network or a critical voice over IP network or a streaming service, or so you can't just pick an IP address out of thin air and apply a block. You've got to put some rigor behind it. And again, the miscreants are aware of this, so they're more likely to use an Amazon. And I'm just picking a hosting company. Amazon actually has quite good practices, but you could use an Amazon as an example, where you've got one IP address in thousands of domains behind that IP. And so therefore it's kind of a blunt instrument from that perspective. There's not a whole lot of precision. And the miscreants, they're aware of this. They'll change the IP address. They use threats that use millions of IP addresses. And so all of a sudden the 200,000 doesn't seem like a whole lot of coverage, and it isn't. So IP address is kind of frowned upon in terms of trying to use that because you got to upkeep it. It has a very low percentage in terms of being efficient over time, and causes a lot of collateral damage if you don't apply it correctly. You need an ombudsman either way. It's not well understood by smaller ISPs like wholesalers. Like the CRTC and Bell, and there's a whole set of wholesale ISPs that are underneath that, right? That just sell bandwidth. It's not well understood by some of those. It's usually done behind the curtains, and because you don't want the miscreants to know what you're doing, and so it's not announced to the subscriber. And if things all of a sudden stop working, the first thing is, well, it must be that blocking thing that was in play when it probably was the application or something else. So, anyways, it doesn't really solve the problem. It used to, when malware was a lot simpler in like 2002 to 2005, 6. But peer-to-peer botnets came along, and miscreants started using domains and fluctuating the IP address of a domain around, and then the name servers of that domain, they would fluctuate that around, and that's called fast flux. And again, it's I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it certainly defeats peer-to-peer, and this defeat IP blocking.
Okay, thanks, John. That's IP address blocking. Can you talk a bit about domain-based blocking?
Domain-based blocking, right? So in 2008, I went to work for a software vendor that specifically wrote an application to allow large-scale ISPs to block domains. And so, I had this whole system of the reputation of a domain. How old is the domain? If it's less than a few days old, you probably don't want to resolve that domain. If it's linked to name servers that are hosting other malicious domains at a high percentage, you don't want to resolve that domain. And a number of checks and balances against a domain before you'd actually go ahead and block it. Now, that can cover millions of domains fairly inexpensively. It does cover the fast flux where they move the IP address around of the domain, because you're just going to block the domain. It does have some more precision. So in that case of Amazon, where you block an IP, you block a bunch of domains. In this case, you're going to flip that around and block one domain. And even though it resolves to that IP, it doesn't really matter because you're only blocking the domain. And it doesn't have the issues of IPv6. So, it's more scalable, and it does give a broader coverage. It can cause collateral damage on the negative side. You've got to, again, continue to do that validation, verification around, what else is being done with this domain, who owns it, that kind of stuff. But do they have a good anti-abuse policy? Could you much more quickly just send, like if it was GoDaddy hosting that domain, could you not just send them a notification saying, hey, you got a bad domain, maybe look at who registered it, the IP that's registering that, and they'll hit hundreds of domains that were registered by that miscreant, and they can knock out many more legitimately, take out miscreants that are intentionally registering domains, and maybe close loopholes in their registration system or what have you. Now I choose to GoDaddy. They have great practices around that. Again, I'm not trying to single out a single company. I'm just using that as an example of types of things that can happen. The only other thing around this is it doesn't cover peer-to-peer, and again, it doesn't cover people that use Google DNS or use other over-the-top players like OpenDNS or other DNS vendors, and it doesn't cover DNS changer malware, where there's variants of malware out there that will change your DNS servers on your PC or change them on your home router. And in that case, the game's over. You're going to be using someone else's DNS, and therefore they can become man in the middle, or they can do whatever they want with your resolution of the domains that you're trying to access while you're on the internet.
So those are the two main forms of blocking. What about Project CleanFeed, which I take it offers a more targeted approach?
Clean feed's kind of, without getting into all the details, because there's some bits of clean feed that we just don't disclose, but it is modestly more expensive to deploy and manage. It is precision of a URL. It has the limitations of IP blocking, but it also passed what I'll call, and I think you write for the Toronto Star, right? So it passes the Toronto Star test or the Globe and Mail test, which means that when ISPs deployed clean feed, there wasn't anyone complaining, and the public backlash on a service like that was minimal. In fact, people were quite happy. And I think that there's some of that with botnet blocking, but as we kind of unpeel the onion, there's differences between those two, meaning that like child exploitation sites are a lot. There's a finite number of them, and they're more static in nature in a lot of cases. And it is illegal content, right? That's it's something you need to think about. It also doesn't cover peer-to-peer. It doesn't cover the fast fluxing of domains. It doesn't. It's not well understood by smaller ISPs to go off and do this, and so it's kind of a point solution that was put in place for with a lot more than just technology. There was more public policy work that we did when this went into play, than there was technology deployment. And it all surrounded a lot of what I already covered around, illegal content. Assume that it's unintentional access, precision blocking, small number of blocks, and only to work closely with folks like CyberTip, so that they can supply a list like that and vet it and be the ombudsman, and do the adjudication of that. You need those pieces of the puzzle for this solution to work. Botnets, they're so dynamic in nature, and they're purpose built to change and to evade. Whereas a website like content, like copyright, very static type of content, a lot easier from a technology perspective to block. But then when you look at the public perception of that, and I'm more of a technologist than I am, I guess a politician. But I think that there's a different stress test when you look at the two, or in this sense, the three of them: copyright, child exploitation, botnet blocking.
As I was listening to you describe the challenges, I'm hearing at least a couple of things. One, I'm hearing that if we're specifically concerned with botnets, as the CRTC is as part of its consultation, some of these kinds of technologies that they're envisioning from a blocking perspective just aren't up to a challenge of something that is involved with such continual evolution that it's just not up to the task. Beyond that, though, what I heard, especially when you start thinking about the policy implications of some of these sorts of blocking approaches, I'm hearing that there's a lack of transparency oftentimes associated with this. We don't know what's being blocked. Sometimes that's intentional, but generally speaking, users won't know what's taking place. There's a bit of a black box, so to speak, when it comes to some of these blocking activities. And that what's needed at a minimum around this is some kind of oversight, due process to ensure that what is being blocked is appropriate under the circumstances, and we're not kind of just setting up a system where stuff's being blocked. Nobody really knows what it necessarily is or why it's being blocked, and there isn't a whole lot of accountability or transparency associated with it.
Yeah, so I'll just back up a little bit and address the technology. In 2008, IP blocking was defeated. In fact, in 2021, I believe, or late 2020, IPv6 traffic in Canada surpassed IPv4. So that train left the station as well. So, the technologies have been largely defeated. Yes, that you can still get some efficiency. So I don't want to say it's completely defeated, but it's, the efficiencies you're going to get are slim. And to put something in, particularly to regulate where no other country is regulating in this space, that's at least in the G7, or, a lot of them have come up with these voluntary codes. I guess my opinion is, we've got the CCTX, so cctx.ca is Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange was formed in 2015. Has all the banks, has all the telco, a lot of the telcos, has government involved, and they're a clearinghouse for this type of data, right? So if the CRTC were to create a voluntary practice. And I think you should try volunteering in anything that you're going to pursue. You should at least take a look at what Industry Canada's got in as a voluntary practice, and certainly look at what CCTX has done. And I would suggest that they should work with CCTX because that way the information the CRTC could share around botnets that are active could be, given to companies like TD Bank. TD Bank, I think, has more U.S. branches than they do in Canada. So they'd be very interested in malicious IPs, domains. So they couldn't just have, Canadian coverage, but maybe their worldwide coverage. That's just an example. Or, other banks that are involved. They've got assets that are worldwide. Why wouldn't we want them to block things on their own firewalls in other countries? So get the information, okay? Get the IPs, domains, the techniques, and practices of the miscreants. Get that information over to in a secure way, in a trusted way, over to CCTX, so it can be broadly shared. Number one. Number two, make it clear for the telcos that, hey, we'd like you to go ahead, just like they did with telemarketing recently. They made it clear that it's okay to go ahead and block malicious calls to Canadians, right? And lo and behold, TELUS has call control out there, right? And it works really well. I'm a subscriber. It's great. I think that those types of activities will go a lot further in joining the conversation versus creating an entirely new conversation around regulation. That's my opinion on that one.
Okay, so when you're thinking, as we wrap this up, when you're thinking about where we should be going, we've got a regulator that the regulators regulate and is obviously putting more regulation on the table. And from what I'm hearing, you're suggesting that regulatory approaches in a marketplace, or at least in an environment where for the last couple of decades, industry's been working actively with government to find solutions in the interests of everyone without that kind of regulatory layer, ought to be the preferred approach, and that looking to blocking type solutions both runs risks of outdated technology relative to some of the current threats, but also brings with it some significant potential harms that can come when you start looking to blocking as a proposed solution.
That's exactly it, Michael. You've wrapped it up perfectly. I think I couldn't say it any better than you just did. It's really around the same things that we did in the 90s, in the early 2000s, right? Working, getting people together, getting them to the table or to the Zoom call, and working through this stuff and trying to get not just at my fear, to be honest with you, is that Canadians get a false sense of security, that, hey, the telecoms are off blocking a handful of domains that have changed already and some IPs that are already on IPv6, so there's no real protection at all. And they all of a sudden the onus and the liability falls into the telco, when in fact we've taken, and we've got a track record of doing this, taken a very broad-based approach. There's many tools in the tool bag that need to be applied. You've got your public policy piece, you've got technology, you've got consumer education, you've got awareness, you've got social media, right? I mean, they should be playing a part in this as well, and I know they do. They have their own threat exchange. Facebook has a threat exchange. They share all kinds of great information around malicious activity. So I think there's a broader conversation. If you really want to create a multi-pronged approach, I think that's a conversation that the telcos, the banks, I think they'd all be very interested in having, versus a point solution that was outdated about 13 years ago.
All right. Well, you said I couldn't put it any better, but I think you just did. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Michael. My pleasure.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.